The most dangerous secret in the kingdom wasn't hidden in a vault. It was hidden between the pages of a novel written by a girl who could not speak. Sleep had abandoned Alpha King Damien Blackwood long before midnight. The grand clock in the North Tower struck 2 in the morning, its distant chime echoing through the silent halls of Manuscript Palace. Yet the light in the king's private study still burned. Reports from border territories lay untouched across his desk. Letters from noble houses remained unopened. Even the treaty awaiting his royal seal had been forgotten. Instead, Damien sat alone beside the fire, holding a worn stack of handwritten pages. His silver eyes moved slowly across the paper. Then slower. Then stopped entirely. A strange ache settled in his chest. He read the passage again. The king in the story stood alone on a balcony overlooking a sleeping city. Everyone feared him. Everyone obeyed him. Yet no one truly knew him. Damien swallowed hard. The words felt uncomfortably familiar. Whoever had written this story understood things they should not understand. They knew the loneliness hidden beneath duty. They knew the exhaustion behind leadership. They knew the silence that followed every difficult decision. He turned another page. Then another. Hours slipped away unnoticed. Outside, snow drifted across the palace gardens beneath the moonlight. Inside, the king continued reading. For the first time in years, he was not thinking about politics, alliances, or responsibilities. He was thinking about the mysterious writer who had somehow looked straight through the walls he had spent a lifetime building. Meanwhile, several floors below, tucked deep inside the eastern wing of the palace library, Evelyn Hart carefully arranged returned books onto wooden shelves. She moved quietly, almost invisibly, as she always did. Most people barely noticed her presence. To the palace staff, she was simply the mute Omega who copied manuscripts and repaired damaged pages. They knew her face. They knew her silence. They knew nothing else. Evelyn preferred it that way. Words had always lived more comfortably on paper than anywhere else. The library had become her sanctuary long ago. Between towering shelves and dusty volumes, nobody expected conversations from her. Nobody demanded explanations. Nobody looked disappointed when she remained silent. As dawn slowly approached, she finished organizing the final cart of books and paused beside a frost-covered window. Beyond the glass, Manuscript Palace shimmered beneath a blanket of silver light. Somewhere within those walls lived the most powerful alpha in the kingdom. A man everyone feared. A man everyone misunderstood. Evelyn lowered her eyes quickly, as if even thinking about him too long felt dangerous. She pressed a small leather notebook against her chest. Her fingers lingered there for a moment. Inside that notebook lived a secret she had never shared with another soul. Every night, after the palace had fallen asleep, she wrote. She wrote about courage. About loneliness. About hope. And without meaning to, she had slowly written a king into the heart of her story. What Evelyn did not know was that, only a few floors above her, the real Alpha King had already begun reading every word. Morning arrived quietly over Manuscript Palace, painting the snow-covered rooftops in pale gold. Evelyn Hart was already awake. She always was. Long before the servants filled the corridors and long before the nobles emerged from their chambers, she found comfort among shelves and silence. The palace library stretched across nearly half an acre, its towering bookcases reaching toward vaulted ceilings painted with ancient constellations. Most visitors came seeking knowledge. Evelyn came seeking peace. She moved carefully between the shelves, carrying a stack of returned volumes against her chest. A few passing servants nodded politely. Others barely noticed her. She had grown accustomed to that years ago. Being overlooked hurt less when she stopped expecting otherwise. Near the center of the library stood a large oak table where scribes worked throughout the day. Fresh parchment, bottles of ink, and unfinished manuscripts covered its surface. Evelyn settled into her usual chair and began copying a historical text requested by the Royal Archives. Her handwriting flowed gracefully across the page. Every letter precise. Every sentence balanced. Words came naturally to her fingers, even when they could never leave her lips. Around mid-morning, several younger scribes gathered nearby. Their conversation drifted across the room while they organized documents. As often happened, the discussion eventually turned toward the king. One scribe described him as distant. Another called him intimidating. A third insisted he never smiled. Laughter followed. Evelyn kept her eyes lowered. They spoke about him as though he were a legend rather than a person. Yet none of them had ever stood close enough to see the exhaustion behind his eyes during official ceremonies. None of them had noticed how he lingered after public events when everyone else had already gone home. None of them had watched him pause beside memorial plaques honoring those who came before him. Evelyn had. Not because she intended to. Simply because she observed things others overlooked. It was easier to watch than participate. Easier to understand than explain. By afternoon, sunlight poured through stained glass windows and painted colors across the floor. Evelyn finished her assignments and quietly slipped a small notebook from her satchel. She opened it carefully. Inside were pages filled with handwritten notes. Character sketches. Dialogue ideas. Fragments of scenes. The story had started years ago as a distraction. A place where she could speak freely. A place where no one interrupted her silence with pity. The king inside those pages was not perfect. He made mistakes. He doubted himself. He carried burdens too heavy for one person alone. Yet he remained kind beneath everything. Evelyn smiled faintly as she reread a passage she had written the night before. Then footsteps approached. She quickly closed the notebook. An elderly librarian named Margaret stood nearby holding a stack of catalog records. Her warm brown eyes lingered on the notebook for a moment. Then she smiled. Evelyn felt her cheeks warm slightly. Margaret had always suspected there was more hidden behind the quiet Omega than most people realized. Across the palace, far above the library, Damian Blackwood finally closed the manuscript resting in his hands. He stared at the final page he had read. Then he turned back to the beginning and started again. That evening, snow tapped softly against the tall windows of the library as the last visitors drifted away. One by one, lanterns throughout Mooncrest Palace dimmed. Conversations faded. Doors closed. Silence settled over the kingdom's largest collection of books like a familiar blanket. Evelyn Hart waited until the final librarian left before gathering her belongings. It was a routine she had followed for years. During the day, she belonged to the palace. At night, she belonged to her stories. She climbed a narrow spiral staircase hidden behind the Western Archives and entered a small reading alcove tucked beneath the roof. Very few people knew it existed. The room was barely 12 feet wide, with a single desk, a worn armchair, and a round window overlooking the snowy city below. Moonlight spilled across the floorboards in silver patterns. Evelyn sat down, opened her notebook, and exhaled slowly. The moment her pen touched the page, the world seemed to soften. Here, she did not feel invisible. Here, she did not have to explain herself. She began writing. The words flowed faster than usual. In her story, the king stood alone inside a grand hall after a celebration had ended. Hundreds of guests had attended. Hundreds of voices had filled the room. Yet when the music stopped and the doors closed, he found himself surrounded only by silence. Evelyn paused. Her fingers hovered above the page. She knew that feeling. Not because she ruled a kingdom, but because loneliness often sounded exactly the same no matter who carried it. She continued writing. The king walked through empty corridors. He smiled politely during ceremonies. He fulfilled every expectation placed upon him. Yet deep inside, he secretly wondered whether anyone truly saw him beyond his title. Evelyn lowered her gaze and smiled sadly. Sometimes she wondered the same thing. Outside the story, everyone saw a mute Omega. They saw what she could not do. They rarely noticed what she could. Her pen moved again. This time she wrote about kindness. About quiet moments nobody else noticed. A ruler stopping to help an elderly servant pick up dropped papers. A king remembering the names of palace gardeners. A leader who carried responsibility without asking for praise. Those details came easily because they were real. She had witnessed them herself. Not many people paid attention to such things. Evelyn always did. Meanwhile, several floors away, Damien remained awake once again. The manuscript rested open across his desk. The fire beside him had burned low, filling the room with a warm amber glow. He should have been sleeping. Instead, he found himself turning another page. Then another. Something about the story unsettled him in the gentlest possible way. The author seemed to understand thoughts he had never shared with anyone. Not his advisors. Not his counsel. Not even his closest friends. It was impossible. Yet every chapter felt personal. Familiar. Honest. Damien leaned back in his chair and stared into the fire. Who are you? He wondered silently. Who sees me this clearly? Back beneath the library roof, Evelyn reached the end of another chapter. Her hand ached slightly from writing. She smiled and carefully closed the notebook. She had no idea that somewhere inside the palace, the very person inspiring her story had already become unable to stop reading it. The following afternoon brought a steady snowfall that covered Mooncrest Palace in a layer of quiet white. Inside the library, the world felt warm and unchanged. Evelyn spent most of the day repairing damaged pages from a collection of travel journals while sunlight drifted through stained glass windows and scattered colors across the tables. It should have been an ordinary day. Instead, she noticed Margaret watching her more than usual. Whenever Evelyn glanced up, the elderly librarian offered the same thoughtful smile before returning to her work. It was not until late afternoon that the reason became clear. Margaret approached carrying a folded announcement printed on royal parchment. She placed it gently on the table beside Evelyn and tapped the page. Evelyn read the headline. The Royal Literary Competition. Writers from every territory were invited to submit original works. The winning manuscript would receive publication throughout the kingdom and recognition at the winter court gathering. Evelyn blinked and quickly shook her head. Margaret laughed softly. She already knew what that response meant. No. Absolutely not. Evelyn pointed to herself and then waved both hands dismissively. Margaret only smiled wider. She pointed toward Evelyn's notebook resting beside a stack of books. Then she tapped the announcement again. Evelyn immediately covered the notebook with her arm. Her cheeks warmed. The story inside those pages was private. It had always been private. It was the only place where she could say everything she could never speak aloud. The thought of strangers reading it felt impossible. Margaret did not argue further. She simply patted Evelyn's shoulder and returned to her desk. Yet the conversation lingered in Evelyn's thoughts long after it ended. That night, she climbed once again to her hidden alcove beneath the roof. Snowflakes drifted beyond the round window. The city lights glowed softly below. She opened her notebook and began writing. This chapter felt different. More personal. In the story, the king stood beneath winter stars speaking with no one except the silence around him. He confessed fears he would never reveal during daylight. He wondered whether strength always required loneliness. He wondered whether being needed was the same as being loved. Evelyn paused several times while writing those lines. Her fingers tightened around the pen. Something about them felt painfully true. Across the palace, Damien sat alone in his study with the manuscript resting open before him. He had intended to stop after one chapter. Then another chapter had followed. Then another. The story seemed to understand every question he had spent years hiding from the world. As he turned a page, a folded document slipped from beneath a stack of reports on his desk. It was the official notice for the Royal Literary Competition. Damien glanced at it absent-mindedly before looking back at the manuscript. A strange thought crossed his mind. Whoever wrote this deserved to be known. Deserved to be heard. The realization settled deeply within him. Somewhere in his kingdom lived a person capable of putting feelings into words that even he could not explain. For the first time, Damien found himself wanting something unrelated to duty, politics, or leadership. He wanted to meet the author. 3 days later, the snowfall finally stopped. Clear blue skies stretched above Mooncrest Palace, and sunlight sparkled across the frozen gardens like scattered diamonds. Evelyn welcomed the quiet rhythm of another ordinary morning. Books needed cataloging. Records needed copying. Shelves needed organizing. Simple tasks brought comfort because they asked nothing from her except patience and care. Yet she could not shake the strange feeling that something was changing. Margaret seemed unusually cheerful. Several librarians whispered excitedly whenever royal announcements arrived. Even the palace messengers moved with unusual urgency. Evelyn assumed it had something to do with preparations for the upcoming winter court gathering. She paid little attention. Grand events belonged to nobles, advisors, and dignitaries. Not to a mute Omega who spent her days surrounded by books. During her lunch break, she slipped away to her favorite window overlooking the eastern courtyard. Snow still covered the stone paths below. Palace workers crossed the grounds carrying supplies while distant bells echoed from the city beyond the walls. Evelyn opened her notebook and reread the latest chapter. The story had grown larger than she ever intended. The king within its pages no longer felt like a character. He felt real. Not because he resembled the ruler everyone knew, but because he reflected the person she suspected existed beneath the crown. Someone carrying responsibilities too heavy to set down. Someone who never allowed himself to appear tired. Someone who quietly protected others while expecting nothing in return. A faint smile touched her lips. Then she closed the notebook quickly when footsteps approached. It was Margaret again. The elderly librarian handed her a stack of returned manuscripts and pointed toward the archive room. Evelyn followed without question. What she did not notice was the thoughtful look Margaret gave the notebook before turning away. Later that evening, after most of the library staff had left, Margaret remained behind. She sat alone at her desk beneath a reading lamp while reviewing paperwork related to the royal literary competition. Hundreds of submissions had arrived from every corner of the kingdom. Poems, novels, memoirs, historical works. She sighed and began sorting through them. Then her gaze drifted toward a familiar notebook resting on a nearby shelf. Margaret hesitated. She knew she should not. She also knew extraordinary talent often hid where nobody thought to look. After a long moment, she carefully opened the notebook and began reading. 1 chapter became 2. 2 became 5. By the time midnight arrived, tears shimmered in her eyes. The story was beautiful. Honest. Deeply human. It carried the kind of emotional truth that could not be taught. Margaret closed the notebook slowly. Her heart felt full. The next morning, before Evelyn arrived, Margaret copied the manuscript with meticulous care and submitted it to the royal literary competition under a simple title. She did not add a name. She did not tell anyone where it came from. She only attached a note requesting anonymous consideration. Then she sealed the package and sent it away. Several miles across the palace grounds, a courier delivered the newest competition entries to the royal judging committee. Among dozens of manuscripts stacked neatly inside polished wooden crates rested one anonymous story destined to find its way into the hands of the king. The judging process began the following week. Manuscripts arrived daily in polished wooden crates and disappeared just as quickly beneath mountains of evaluations, notes, and recommendations. Most were read by scholars, historians, and literary advisors before reaching the final selection committee. Only a handful ever found their way to the king's desk. Damien expected nothing unusual when the latest stack arrived in his study. He had already reviewed dozens of entries. Some were impressive. Others were forgettable. Many were technically excellent but lacked something deeper. He read them dutifully, offered his comments, and moved on. Then he opened one anonymous manuscript. At first, he intended to read only a few pages. The evening was already busy. A council meeting awaited him the next morning. Several trade agreements required review. Important correspondence sat unopened nearby. Yet within minutes, all of it faded into the background. The story drew him in with quiet confidence. There were no grand battles. No dramatic speeches. No attempts to impress. Instead, there was honesty. The king within the story felt real. His responsibilities felt heavy. His victories felt lonely. His kindness appeared in small moments that most people would overlook. Damien frowned slightly as he continued reading. How could a stranger know these things? More importantly, why did it feel as though the author understood him better than people who had worked beside him for years? He reached a chapter describing a ruler walking through an empty palace long after everyone else had gone to sleep. The character paused beside a window overlooking the city and wondered whether leadership always required sacrifice. Damien stared at the page. A few nights earlier, he had done exactly that. No one had seen him. No one should have known. Yet somehow the emotions mirrored his own with unsettling accuracy. He continued reading. Midnight passed. Then 1 o'clock. The fire in the hearth burned lower. Snow drifted softly beyond the windows. Still he read. For the first time in years, he felt understood. Not admired. Not feared. Understood. Meanwhile, Evelyn remained completely unaware of what was happening. Her days continued as usual. She organized shelves. Restored damaged books. Copied records for the royal archives. Every evening she returned to her hidden alcove and added new chapters to her notebook. Sometimes she smiled while writing. Sometimes tears blurred her vision. The story had become part of her. A place where every unspoken thought could finally breathe. One afternoon, while arranging books near the eastern stacks, she noticed Margaret watching her again. The older woman seemed pleased about something. Evelyn raised an eyebrow in silent question. Margaret simply smiled and returned to her work. Across the palace, Damien finished another chapter and slowly closed the manuscript. His chest felt unexpectedly tight. He looked toward the darkened window beside his desk. For several moments he remained completely still. Then he opened the manuscript again and reread his favorite passages. Not because he needed to. Because he wanted to. The author had given words to feelings he had never been able to explain. And for the first time since discovering the story, Damien realized he no longer cared whether it won the competition. He only wanted one thing. He wanted to find the person who wrote it. The decision was made before Damien even realized it. The moment he finished the final page, he pressed a hand against the manuscript and stared at the firelight dancing across his desk. The palace felt different now. Larger somehow. As if somewhere within its countless halls and corridors walked a person carrying a secret powerful enough to reach the king himself. The next morning, he summoned the literary committee. Advisors, scholars, and judges filled the conference chamber expecting discussions about rankings and finalists. Instead, Damien held up the anonymous manuscript. The room fell silent. He asked only one question. Who wrote this? No one had an answer. The submission had arrived without a name. Without a title page identifying the author. Without any clue except the story itself. Several judges praised the writing. Others praised the emotional depth. One elderly professor called it the finest manuscript he had read in 20 years. Damien listened carefully. Yet none of their compliments mattered as much as the simple fact that nobody knew who had written it. By afternoon, word spread through the palace. The king was searching for an anonymous author. Servants whispered about it while carrying linens through hallways. Courtiers speculated over afternoon tea. Scholars searched records. Messengers carried inquiries throughout the kingdom. Everyone seemed fascinated by the mystery. Everyone except Evelyn. She remained blissfully unaware. Her greatest concern that day involved reorganizing a collection of historical maps recently donated to the archives. She spent hours carefully unfolding fragile parchment and labeling storage cases. The work required concentration. It also kept her away from palace gossip. Around noon, Margaret appeared carrying several books. There was a strange sparkle in her eyes. Evelyn noticed it immediately. The older woman seemed nervous and excited at the same time. Before Evelyn could ask, Margaret squeezed her shoulder affectionately and hurried away again. Confused, Evelyn watched her disappear around a corner. Meanwhile, Damien continued reading certain passages over and over. He had nearly memorized entire sections. One chapter in particular refused to leave his thoughts. The fictional king stood before a crowd while secretly carrying doubts nobody could see. The passage ended with a single line. The loneliest people are often the ones everyone believes are strongest. Damien had read those words at least 10 times. Each time, they felt more personal. By evening, his curiosity had become something deeper. Respect. Gratitude. Admiration. Whoever the author was, they possessed extraordinary empathy. They had looked beyond titles and appearances. Beyond power and reputation. They had written directly to the heart of a person they had never met. Or so Damien believed. As twilight settled over Mooncrest Palace, an exhausted assistant finally delivered a small discovery. The manuscript had been submitted through the palace library. No author listed. No identifying information. Only one clue remained. Someone inside the library had sent it. Damien's eyes narrowed thoughtfully. For the first time, the mystery felt closer. Much closer. Across the palace, Evelyn sat beneath her hidden round window and began writing another chapter. Snowflakes drifted through the night sky beyond the glass. Her pen moved steadily across the page. She smiled softly while adding a scene where the king finally realizes he is not as alone as he believes. What she did not know was that, at that very moment, the real king had already started walking toward the library. The next morning arrived with an energy unlike anything Evelyn had experienced before. The library, usually calm and predictable, buzzed with quiet excitement. Visitors arrived earlier than usual. Messengers appeared and disappeared throughout the day. Even scholars who normally buried themselves in research seemed distracted. Evelyn noticed the change immediately but could not understand the cause. She spent the morning cataloging newly arrived books while conversations drifted around her like distant music. Again and again she caught fragments of the same discussion. The anonymous author. The royal competition. The king's search. She paid little attention. Thousands of people lived within the kingdom. Surely the mystery involved someone important. Someone talented enough to attract the attention of the entire court. Someone very different from her. Near midday, a group of palace officials entered the library. Their arrival instantly silenced the room. Every librarian looked up. Every scholar paused. Evelyn did the same. The official spoke quietly with Margaret near the front desk. The older woman's eyes widened. She glanced across the room toward Evelyn. Then she quickly looked away. Evelyn felt a knot of confusion tighten in her stomach. Something was happening. Something she did not understand. Hours later, as afternoon sunlight painted golden patterns across the library floor, Margaret finally approached her. The older woman looked nervous. Excited. Emotional. She gently placed a folded invitation on the table. Evelyn opened it. Her eyes widened immediately. She read the words twice. Then 3 times. An official invitation to attend the winter court gathering as a special guest of the Royal Literary Committee. Evelyn stared at the parchment. There had to be a mistake. She looked up in disbelief. Margaret reached across the table and squeezed her hand. Her smile carried both apology and pride. In that instant, everything became clear. The competition. The mysterious smiles. The strange behavior. The manuscript. Evelyn's heart nearly stopped. She shook her head rapidly. Margaret nodded. Yes. The notebook. The story. The one she had secretly submitted. Panic and disbelief collided inside Evelyn all at once. She pointed toward herself. Margaret nodded again. Tears glimmered in her eyes. Before Evelyn could react further, another figure appeared at the entrance of the library. Conversation stopped immediately. Every head turned. The room fell completely silent. Damian Blackwood stood beneath the archway. He was not surrounded by guards. He carried no royal announcements. He simply stood there, his silver eyes scanning the room. For a brief moment, nobody moved. Then his gaze settled on Evelyn. Something strange passed through his expression. Recognition. Relief. Wonder. Not because he knew she was the author. Not yet. But because for the first time, he saw the quiet Omega he had noticed countless times in passing. The one always hidden among books. The one who seemed more comfortable listening than speaking. Evelyn froze. Damian took a slow step forward. Then another. Neither of them spoke. Yet somehow the silence between them felt louder than any conversation. Deep inside, Damian felt the same certainty growing stronger. The person he had been searching for was closer than he ever imagined. 2 nights later, the winter court gathering filled the grand hall of Mooncrest Palace with light, music, and anticipation. Crystal chandeliers shimmered overhead while nobles, scholars, and honored guests gathered beneath banners of silver and midnight blue. Evelyn stood near the back of the hall, wishing she could disappear among the crowd. Her hands trembled slightly as she clutched the invitation. Everything felt unreal. She had spent years hiding behind shelves and books. Now she stood inside the most important event of the season, surrounded by hundreds of people. The literary committee announced the finalists first. Applause echoed through the hall. Names were called. Writers stepped forward. Smiles filled the room. Yet one final selection remained. The anonymous manuscript. The story that had captivated judges throughout the kingdom. The story nobody could stop talking about. A hush settled over the audience. Damian stepped onto the stage himself. The room instantly fell silent. He held a familiar stack of pages in his hands. Evelyn recognized them immediately. Her breath caught. Every heartbeat seemed to echo through her chest. Damian looked across the crowd before opening the manuscript. For a moment, he simply stood there beneath the light. Then he began to read. His voice carried clearly through the hall. The passage described a king who appeared strong because the world needed him to be strong. A king who carried responsibility with grace while quietly wondering if anyone truly understood him. The words washed over the audience. Some smiled. Others lowered their eyes thoughtfully. Many seemed moved. Damian continued reading until he reached the final lines of the passage. Then he stopped. Silence followed. Not uncomfortable silence. The kind that exists when something important has touched every heart in the room. Slowly, Damian closed the manuscript. His gaze moved through the crowd until it found Evelyn standing near the back. This time there was no uncertainty in his expression. He knew. Somehow he knew. The room watched as he stepped down from the stage and walked through the crowd. Nobles moved aside. Scholars exchanged confused glances. Nobody understood where he was going. Evelyn's pulse raced. She could barely breathe. Damian stopped directly in front of her. For several seconds, neither moved. Then he held out the manuscript. Tears gathered in Evelyn's eyes. Around them, the hall remained completely silent. Damian smiled softly. It was the first genuine smile many people in the room had ever seen from their king. He placed the manuscript into her hands and spoke words she would remember for the rest of her life. You gave a voice to thoughts I never knew how to share. You saw a person where everyone else saw a crown. Evelyn looked down, overwhelmed. Her vision blurred. She wanted to answer. Wanted to explain. Wanted to tell him everything she had poured into those pages. But no words came. They never had. Damien seemed to understand anyway. He gently touched the cover of the manuscript and said, "You believed your silence made you invisible. But every page proved the opposite. The entire kingdom heard your heart." Tears slipped down Evelyn's cheeks. Around them, applause slowly began. Then grew louder. Then louder still. The crowd rose to its feet. Not for a king. Not for a title. But for a quiet Omega who had spent years believing nobody saw her. As the hall filled with applause, Damien remained beside her. And for the first time, Evelyn realized something extraordinary. The story she thought she had written alone had led her exactly where she was meant to be. Beneath the lights of Mooncrest Palace, surrounded by people who finally understood her worth, she no longer felt invisible. And neither of them felt alone.